Thank you, Susan. Hi, everyone. I am Clara McIver, one of several leaders at Plymouth Area Indivisible. And as Sue said, there's going to be a recording. So if you don't want to be seen, you can turn off your video camera. Although we would love to see you, actually. It's much nicer that way for the speaker. Um, let's see, what else should I mention? Oh, at the end, there will be a question and answer portion of the program. So I think that the easiest thing actually would be for you to put your questions in the chat, which is, if you're on a laptop, it's usually on a bar across the bottom. I'm not sure where it would be on your phones. But one of the things that you can do when you do that is you can put ASK in capital letters right before your question. That will help us find your question and not lose it in the chat. So I want to turn this over rather quickly to Paul Huffman from the League of Women Voters of Minnesota, because he has a very full program to present to us tonight. So I'm going to let him do his own introduction and take it away, Paul.
All right, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Susan, for the introduction and the opportunity. What I'll do is I'm going to share my screen here just as we get started. I'm the redistricting coordinator for League of Women Voters Minnesota. I've been with the league. I'm a volunteer, but I basically at this point work full time since we're in the heat of the activity with redistricting and activities around that with the legislative session and the mapping coming up. My background briefly, I served in the Navy and nuclear submarines for 13 years and retired from the reserves. And I worked for Xcel Energy and other companies for about 28 years before I retired about 2 years ago. So that's my background, but I've always been very interested in government democracy issues. I'm currently finishing up a certificate in election administration at the University of Minnesota Humphrey School, graduate school. So that's a little bit about my background. And I noticed Peter Watson's here, and I've learned a lot from Peter in the process of this. And we're very fortunate to have him on here as well. So my goal this evening is not to teach you everything there is to know about redistricting, because that would take weeks. It's really to give you an overview of redistricting and apportionment, talk about the timeline that we have in front of us, talk about why it matters, give you a couple of examples that you can use if you're in conversation with people about who say, why should I care about redistricting? So how does it matter to you on a local basis? And that's part of what we're focusing on is local redistricting this year. And then what you can do in addition to take action, get involved on redistricting and in the state and on a local level. There is a follow-up meeting on the 18th that will provide additional opportunity, the 16th, that'll provide additional opportunity to go into deeper detail, in particular about actions that can be taken, mapping and local redistricting. So that's another opportunity to get to further detail on this. One of the things I want to, make sure I talk about is that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We neither support nor oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government. We do always focus on and work on issues that are vital concerns to our members and members of the public. So we are principled in our positions on policy. That does mean our positions can be perceived as partisan, but we are consistent in our standards and our stance on those policies. Redistricting and gerrymandering is something that both parties have been guilty of abusing, and I'll talk about that in the course of this program. But for anybody who is really interested in making sure the government is representative of the people, not of the elected representatives, then fairness in redistricting, nonpartisanship is something I think we can all support. What I want to start off first with is the timeline. What I'm going to tell you is that most of this timeline is my estimate. I think it's, and I've talked to Peter and I've talked to Nick Harper, who some of you know at the League of Women Voters, Anastasia, building a career from Common Cause. We've all talked about what we think is the likely schedule. And we think this is pretty close. Anybody who tells you they know exactly what it is wrong, because nobody knows. There's a couple of things here I think you can hang your hat on that I'll cover. The things that are underlined and bolded, those are opportunities for engagement in the process with the legislature or other bodies, and I'll talk about that. The first date here is April 30th. That's when apportionment data is expected to go to the president from the Census Bureau. There's been some additional information out here in the last day from Hansi Lo Wang of NPR, if you track him on Twitter. He's been very in touch with what the Census Bureau is doing and how they're going through their data review and reconciliation. That April 30th date continues to look pretty good. That normally is expected by the end of December, but due to COVID and due to data issues that have been identified, that's been delayed to the end of April. That is when we find out in Minnesota whether we still have 8 congressional seats or 7. And just like with the NCAA basketball, we're on the bubble and we won't know until that apportionment data comes out here in about 6 weeks. Right now, we're in the midst of the legislative session. This is the opportunity to engage legislators on the process for map development. I'll talk a little bit about what our current requirements are in Minnesota from a high level on mapping, but there's a lot of opportunity to adopt practices that other states have to make it more open and transparent, provide greater engagement and input from the public, and provide to be more objective and less political process. So this is the time to contact legislators on what bills are in progress or just in principle to advocate for additional guidance on how to perform that. The end of September is the current estimate right now when census block data is going to go to the states. I think that's good, but I think anybody who knows for certain, they don't. As the Census Bureau continues to work through addressing data accuracy issues, that will become more clear. That census block data is what the legislature uses to do the redistricting, because you go right down to the block level from the census in order to draw the maps. Now, one of the things I'd say is that when you ask legislators, yes, you're right that they can't draw the final maps until they receive the census block data. But no, they can do a lot of work before then. There's a lot of work the legislature can do, the Legislative Coordinating Committee is doing with existing American Community Survey data and Census Bureau data in order to take a start at drawing lines. They can define process. They can talk about criteria, which the Senate has a bill that's been introduced on criteria. There's much that they could do. They could, if they chose, take public input on district maps prior to the block data coming out. So, that's a point that you could potentially engage elected representatives on is, taking those steps now to be ready when the census block data is received. At some point this fall and winter, there will be legislative hearings. There's been talk about when that might occur or if it might not occur. And so that's something we have to wait and see on. But there will be an opportunity for hearings on maps potentially. And that's the opportunity to go to legislators through your legislator or directly to those committees. Each, the Senate and the House, both have a redistricting committee to provide testimony and input to what those maps look like. Now, our best estimate from the coalition that League of Women Voters is part of, as is Indivisible, Claire McIver's part of that organization, is that we don't think the legislature will reach agreement. Those positions from the House and Senate are pretty entrenched. And so the likely outcome, or a potential outcome, I would say, is that the two caucuses come up with their own set of maps. Potentially the parties come up with their own sets of maps, which they submit to the courts for input for courts drawing the maps. At some point, the Supreme Court is likely to establish a special redistricting panel. In all of the redistricting cycles going back to 1991, there has been a lawsuit filed shortly after the apportionment data is received. So looking at early to mid-January, normally there is a lawsuit filed. There has been a lawsuit filed already this cycle in Minnesota. Peter Watson, as I mentioned, who's on this call, and some other folks have initiated a lawsuit stating that, and this is what consistently happens, that our current maps are unconstitutional because they are not equal in population. And so that is what is then generally goes into the Supreme Court. It is typically held in abeyance until the legislature and the governor have a chance to act. And then at some point in the future, the Supreme Court will act to establish what's called a special redistricting panel, which would then take inputs, testimony, and draw maps, again, as a contingency if the legislature and the governor can't reach an agreement. Typically that happens in somewhere in June or July, but then again, that goes back to where you get the apportionment data in December, you get the census block data the 1st of April. So that'd be a typical time frame. We're anything but typical. We're about 6 months behind on when that census block data is going to occur. So what we expect, and this is just our best guess, is that somewhere around the 1st of September, the state Supreme Court will establish a special redistricting panel. They're going to do that because that's needed. They need to do that to have an adequate time for that group to get inputs and draw maps as a contingency if the legislature and the governor don't reach agreement. So the special redistricting panel will take inputs in the fall. They'll have hearings in the fall. They'll take testimony and then prepare a set of maps for consideration and approval by the Supreme Court. Somewhere this fall, this is something we don't typically talk about, and I'll get more detail of this next week, is city and county governments should be talking about their redistricting process. After the legislative redistricting is done in February, there's a short period of time in which cities that have wards and county commissioner districts and a few school districts have to be redrawn. There's plenty of time prior to the maps being drawn for city and county governments to talk about how they're going to do that. And there's lots of options that they can pursue, or they can do that in a very kind of non-transparent, opaque manner. But that's an opportunity for engagement. And actually you can engage now and look toward that to at least get them started thinking about it. You can pretty well guarantee that February 15th, 2022, the Minnesota Supreme Court will issue a final redistricting order. What that assumes is that the legislature and governor don't reach agreement on maps, which you think is highly likely. It also is based on Minnesota statute, which gives a time frame in which legislative district boundaries have to be established in order to support the remainder of the precinct boundary drawing process, the city and county redistricting process, and then candidate filing and primary process for the fall 2022 election. So all of that pushes back that date to February 15th. That is consistent with what's happened in the last 3 redistricting cycles going back to 1992. And then in April, March and April, we kick off the local redistricting hearings, and those lines get drawn. What I'll do is just stop here briefly and see if there's any specific questions to this before I move on.
There have been 2 questions, Paul. The first one is from Lee, and he asks, won't the delay in the census results mess up the redistricting schedule? It will shorten the time to pick candidates.
I think the redistricting schedule, I think shortening the time to pick candidates, I think partly what you're talking about is maybe the caucuses. And I've had some discussion with folks. I'm not deeply into the caucus process, but the caucuses, what I've been told is that they're going to pick candidates based on existing boundaries. And that's going to happen there. But it does impact the candidate filing process. And I have talked to some folks who say that the time, if you want to run for the Minnesota House, the time to do it is a year ending in 2, because that's when there's the shortest time and people have the less least opportunity to strategize on who's going to run where. So I think from a redistricting standpoint, it certainly makes it challenging. But if again, we look at, we're probably going to go through the Supreme Court and the special redistricting panel. It doesn't shorten that timeline a lot from what it would be historically.
We also have a second question from Susie, who asks, how do we as citizens know what to look for, ask for, or otherwise engage with the House and Senate redistricting committees in order to work toward fair and nonpartisan districts?
Well, Susie, that's a great question. I will talk about some aspects of what you should be looking for kind of at a high level. And then next week I can talk about that in more detail. But that's, there's some specific things to look for in how this process works. So I'll talk through that here in a moment.
One more question. Nancy asks, what will happen if the caucus picks a candidate that cannot run if he or she is no longer in the district after redistricting?
I can't speak to that. I think the caucus is going to have to pick a different candidate. But that goes back to the filing deadline, because by having the districts drawn by February 15th, that supports the filing deadline. But then that's going to have to be within the caucus's governance on how do they select a different candidate if they have that conflict.
Okay, that's it for the questions. Just to remind you, if you have a question, to type in the word ask in the chat and then put your question in. Thanks, Paul.
All right, thanks, Susan. All right, so high level, I think everybody here probably has this apportionment. People get confused sometimes. That's the federal process of deciding how many congressional representatives each state has. And then based on that, each state does redistricting. And redistricting has historically been a state-driven activity. Every state defines how they want to do it. While there's a lot of consistency historically that states generally have the legislature draws the lines and the governor approves or vetoes, right now there's only about 33 states where that's the case. Another 17 states have a variety of commissions or advisory commission setups. And within the 33, there's also some variations in how that works. But by and large, about 2/3 of the states, the model is legislature draws the lines and the governor approves. So it's not something that the federal government generally gets involved in. The question is, why is redistricting important? And I think it's important to be able to articulate this. It's about community representation. And part of what we've been focused on is thinking about community interests. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But it goes to what is the common either historical, economic, or cultural heritage that an area shares. It could be ethnic, it could be racial, it could be economic, it could be around schools, it could be around water, it could be around resources, but it's what's really important to a community of people, and we call that a community of interest, and being able to identify how to ensure those voices are heard and those policy interests are served. And so what we think is that it's important to think about this in terms of policy rather than party, because parties' policy interests can change. I think we've seen that over the last 10 to 15 years with the parties, and some of their policy interests have evolved and changed. So if your community is clear on what their policy interests are and they're able to have their voices heard by the elected leaders, then they have a chance of getting their interests met. And I've got some examples where how those maps are drawn does impact how those interests are met. And there's more examples, but just picked a couple to make sure that I've given you some examples to draw on. There's gerrymandering, and I think I think we all know what gerrymandering is. It's where maps are drawn in a manner which has an extreme benefit. It's drawn in an extreme manner to favor certain policy or political interests. The problem with manipulated maps, they create safe partisan seats where elected officials represent their base and not all the voters. Some examples: California 2002. After the 2000 census, Republicans and Democrats in California kind of made a deal. They said that if you don't argue with me, I'll make sure that your incumbents are safe and my incumbents are safe. And in the elections in 2002, all the incumbents in the legislature in California were reelected by at least 20 percentage points. That doesn't create a government which is accountable to the voters. Michigan 2012, I'll talk about that. Gerrymandering in Michigan and Wisconsin. I think most of us are pretty familiar with Wisconsin's problems. It creates unfair distribution of power that doesn't accurately reflect the will of the voters. I think Michigan is a great example of that, but you can pick other places like Wisconsin where if the legislative map is too conservatively drawn or liberally drawn, you get the elected officials reflecting the base of their party and not the majority of the voters. And that results in laws that are more extreme to the left or the right than where the electorate likely is. So that's a problem as well. And finally, it skews the political process, as I talked about, and results in extreme policy choices. A couple of map examples. I'll go by this pretty quickly. On the left, that was drawn by Republicans. What they did was they connected two congressional districts, one in Toledo and one in Cleveland, that were both represented by Democrats, and eliminated one of the Democratic seats. This is called the stake by the lake, and it is so narrow that if the lake level rises too much, it could potentially be unconstitutional because it's no longer contiguous. The map on the right was drawn by Democrats, and this was one of the maps that was in the case of Redistricting v. Common Cause in 2019. What it did was and the one on the left is packing, the one on the right is cracking, where basically Democrats in the legislature drew a district that divided all the Republicans in multiple districts. And what it did was it includes parts of 4 counties as well as the city of Baltimore. The structure, the problem with this, and you can kind of see this, is that the way they snakes around, if you were a constituent, it's really hard to know who your representative is because there's really no rhyme or reason to how that map is drawn. And if you're the representative, it's hard for you to know who your constituents are, again, because there's no rhyme or reason other than for political benefit about how that map is drawn. Michigan, this is a great example of the consequences of gerrymandering. In 2011, there was a Republican trifecta, and we refer to trifecta as any case where a party has both houses of the legislature and the governor's office. And so they get the ability to make laws without any consideration for the opposition party. In 2011, Republicans got a trifecta out of the 2010 elections in Michigan. They passed an emergency manager bill that gave them the ability to assign an emergency manager to any city or jurisdiction that had problems with their budgets. And you think about Michigan, Republicans, we've got kind of a urban-rural split. The rural areas were governed by Republicans. The urban areas such as Lansing, Detroit, Flint were governed by Democrats. The Republicans didn't have the ability to take action with regards to how the cities were managed, so they implemented this emergency manager bill. Well, in 2012, the Constitution of Michigan allows voters to have a referendum on any bill that does not include authorization of funds. And so by 52.7%, the voters rejected the emergency manager bill. But because of how the state house was gerrymandered, even though Democrats got 53% of the vote, they only got 46% of the seats. And therefore, Republicans held the Senate, the House, and the governor's mansion, and they repassed the emergency manager bill now with an appropriation preventing a voter repeal in December of that year, right after the election. And then in 2013, they appointed the emergency manager to oversee the Flint budget. 2014, that emergency manager then approved moving the water supply for the city of Flint from the Detroit water system to the Flint River, which then resulted in damage to piping, release of lead in the water supply, impacting the health and safety of the people of Flint. Now, if you think about this, this is people who are not elected by the people making decisions that affects the health and safety of those people. There's no accountability because of the gerrymandering process that occurred in Flint. And I think that's a very stark example of the trouble you get into when you've got gerrymandered maps. An example of maps, and I can't tell you for sure whether it was done with malicious intent, but this is local redistricting in Minneapolis. And if you look, the different colored areas are different wards. And on the left, you've got the Powderhorn area of Minneapolis. That is a majority minority district area. the largest minority group is Hispanic. The area on the right is Cedar Riverside. If you're familiar with that area, that's a majority minority area, and it's a majority Black area. Both of those areas were split. And the left, you got 4 different wards. On the right, you've got 4 different wards. So the result is that those communities were not able to have representation. Again, whether that was deliberate or not, I can't speak to, but that was the effect. So what happened? In 2010, the ward lines in Minneapolis are drawn by the Charter Commission. The citizens of Minneapolis approved the change of the Charter Commission to impanel an advisory commission, which included community representatives. That resulted in different maps, and they had their first Somali American council member from the Cedar Riverside area. They had their first Mexican American council member from the Powderhorn area, and their first Hmong American council member. And I think we all know that this results in more contentious city council meetings, but it also results in meetings that result in the long term with policies more representative of the voices of the communities, rather than a city council that's all agreeable because everybody sees these the same way, because they all come from the same community or the same kind of cultural background. So it's important to have that representation to make sure all the voices are at the table. The last example I'll give you is Rochester. And one of the things that the communities need to think about is how are their voices being heard and policy interests being served by how the legislative lines are drawn. As best I can tell from talking to folks in Rochester, 10 years ago, they thought it was a good idea to have 2 different state senators representing the city of Rochester. So the line for, say, Senate districts 25, 26 goes right through the middle of Rochester. What's happened over time, though, if you think about it, is the policy interests of the Republican Party have changed. The policy interests of Rochester have changed as it become more diverse. It's now about 28% non-white. And their concerns are more around infrastructure, some social justice, public safety, transit, things of that nature. A lot of the people in both Senate districts 25 and 26 are more rural interest, rural development, and less oriented toward what the districts of Rochester are. This isn't to say that either set of interests is right or wrong. It just means, do we have the right balance in the voices to reflect the interests of the city of Rochester as well as the rest of Olmsted County in the legislature? So in some cases, the local communities will say yes, because our representatives are going to be representing other communities similar to us, and therefore their interests are similar to us, so that's okay. In other cases, like Rochester, you look and say, those representatives are going to be representing communities that are very different from us. Their interests are different than us. So we may want to think differently about that. And that's something to think about. And then from a district standpoint, what you get on the left, and again, I prefer not to think in D's and R's, but that's how some of us go, that's one way to look at it. It's easy, is you got a couple of districts that are heavily Democratic. You got one district that's heavily Republican, and the 2 Senate districts and 1 House district are very narrowly Republican. So that it indicates that probably those policy interests aren't balanced from the way that map is currently drawn. So what I'll talk about now is how maps are drawn, and just high level, think of 3 things. And I spent 28 years in business and a lot of business process and business strategy things. And you think of these 3 things, and Nick Harper, I'll give credit to Nick from the League of Women Voters. He's our civic engagement director, thinking in terms of people, principles, and process. And if you're in business, that works in business as well, because processes boil down to the people, the principles of process. Who's doing the work? Who's making the decisions? Principles is what needs to be considered. What are the rules or criteria? And then the process. What meetings are held? How are they announced? Who's there? What's the input? How's that process work? So think of those 3 things. And I'll tell you how it works in Minnesota is the legislature draws the map, the governor approves the vetoes. That's how the process was supposed to work. What happens is, the last 3 cycles is the courts draw the map and they tell us what the maps are going to be. From a principle standpoint in the law, there's really no document required criteria beyond federal law and state constitution. You can look to some previous court cases in the state to get some inkling of what might be applied. But from a strict court legal standpoint, there's only a few things about equality in population, not having a purpose or effect of diluting racial or ethnic minority, convenient contiguous territory. There's some other things, but it's really pretty limited. If the legislature does it, goes to the courts, there's some prior practice and precedent how the courts will approach it that's a little bit different. From a process standpoint, there's really no legal or administrative process on how the legislature draws the maps. It's a political process. They will have hearings of some sort, but they can have a lot of work behind closed doors as long as they follow the open meeting laws and how that's conducted in order how to do the maps. And there's no requirement in Minnesota for public input as there is in 28 other states. And so if you look at what that results in, between 1913 and 1959, there was no legislative redistricting in Minnesota. No requirement for equal population before 1964. And this is several Supreme Court cases, Reynolds v. Sims, most notably, that really said you had to have equal population between districts. Since 1960, all the legislative or congressional maps except one have been drawn, rejected, or redrawn by the courts. And then with courts, the question is, why not let the courts draw the maps? Well, the courts, a couple of things. One, they have a very strong focus on equality and population. They are going to tend to limit public input. They'll take public input, but that's not primarily why they're there. Judges are there, and this is the special redistricting panel is an appointed panel of judges. They're not there to make policy. They're there to make sure the maps are legal. And so as a result, they're going to take input. They'll follow the criteria that's been agreed upon through the Supreme Court's order. But they'll make generally incremental changes to the maps, and they're likely not doing what's optimal for the residents of the state. What they're going to develop will be legal, but it's not going to be ideal. It's not going to reflect all the voices of the people. So our position and a position of the alliance we're part of is the current system doesn't work. It's not worked for the last 60 years. It's not going to work this year. And so why should we assume it's going to work in the future and keep doing this? Einstein's term about you keep doing the same thing over and over and you expect different results, that's called insanity. So we keep doing the same thing. And what the outcomes are is going to be, because there's no statute or law requiring transparency or objective criteria, then if there's split government, we're not going to agree and the courts are going to order the maps. If one party controls all the levers, a trifecta, then it's highly likely you're going to draw the maps that benefit the governing party. That's just human nature. That is not to say our elected representatives lack integrity or not honest and honorable people, because they are individually. But a party together just has a strong tendency to use that opportunity toward political advantage. The federal courts, based on Rucha v. Common Cause, the federal courts have drawn a hard line that says that partisan gerrymandering is not their problem. And there becomes a very difficult line to draw between what's partisan, what's racial, because as Justice Kagan pointed out in Mississippi, partisan gerrymandering is racial gerrymandering. The same thing applies in South Carolina and Alabama and some other states. The Minnesota Constitution, there's a question about how much help that would be. We do not have language in our Constitution similar to places like Pennsylvania, North Carolina around fair and equal elections that could be used as an argument if we had a partisan gerrymander in Minnesota. We could be in the spot that Wisconsin is in, where they have a highly politicized judiciary, which is not receptive to fairness arguments in that state. So my point to you is continue to rely on divided government. And there was an editorial in MinnPost, I think it was about a month or 6 weeks ago, says Minnesotans like divided government. I think divided government only works until you don't have divided government, and then you're stuck. And so while we can't fix it entirely for 2022, we can fix it for 2030 and beyond by changing what that system is in Minnesota. So the question is, how could maps be drawn? A couple of things to think about. One is redistricting commissions. And these are just a couple of the varieties of redistricting commissions out there. Some of those states, independent commissions that a number of states have now, advisory commissions, and I would hold up Iowa as a great example of an advisory commission, very strong criteria and process in statute in Iowa. And that's really because they got taken to court and lost a couple of times in the 60s and 70s. Appointee commissions, legislative commissions. So that's a topic we could dive a lot deeper into, but we really think an independent commission is the ideal for Minnesota. There's other types of commissions that would be workable. If you get away from what you'd really prefer and what you really want to have, I think ultimately we need to get this out of the hands of the legislature into some other body where a single party can't control the outcome. Redistricting criteria, talk about principles. There's a lot of things that could be criteria. These are a lot of times included in legislation that the legislature enacts. It's included in court orders, but it's nowhere in law in Minnesota. It is in law in some other states, especially those that have commissions. Communities of interest and what those are. And we talked about that briefly. The American Indian communities, potentially, preservation of boundaries, not purposely favoring a party or candidate, no potential effect or bias against or for a party, compactness, competition, and so on. Currently, these are not legally required in Minnesota, so that if the legislature were and the governor's mansion were held by one party and they gerrymandered a map, there's nothing in law that the legislature could point, that the court, could point to and say you violated the law. That is a good argument for criteria in law, is at least to put something in place that says these are rules you have to follow when doing redistricting, whether it's the courts or whether it's the legislature. Process, public engagement. This is something I haven't historically talked about with this presentation. It's something new, but as I've been involved with NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, and looking at other states, there's a lot of states that have opportunity for public input. And we pride ourselves in Minnesota, our civic engagement, yet our legislature is really missing an opportunity to be with the better practices of other states. There's public hearings, but those aren't really engaging the public and providing input. And there are a number of states that require the ability to provide input. There's others that have the ability, but it's not required in law, such as Oklahoma. A number of states have computer portals for submission. I will tell you that the county I live in, Washington County, we've talked to our county commissioner, and they're going to work toward getting a portal on our county website to allow citizen input on our county commissioner maps. So something you could think about locally. Public notice, prescribing a procedure to seek court review, and so on. In all, there's 28 states that provide for public input involving redistricting, and Minnesota is not one of them. So another opportunity. So where we are today, this is a map just briefly that shows where we are with population distribution with the current maps. This is a House district population because it's probably the most granular where we have this detail. The darker green is more below the ideal population. The ideal population for a House district right now, in 2019 was 42,319, about 42,000 people. If it's dark green, that says it's more than 4% below what that population was. The brown is above the population. So if you look at the dark brown, especially the West Metro, Southwest Metro, those areas are greater than 4% above. And then the white ones are ones that are within 1%. So they're just right. If you think in terms of, if you don't have enough people in your district, it's going to have to get bigger to get more people in it. If you have too many people in a district, it's going to get smaller. And it's kind of like the old balloon. If you push in one point, it's going to have to move out the other. So those lines are going to move. It's inevitable. And on the right is Wright County, most of Wright County right now. And you've got 4 House districts in your county, and those lines are likely to move in Wright County. And so then the question is, how do you want them to move? What do you want that to look like? And it's interesting, if you look at the map on the left, the dark brown areas from northwest to southeast are Moorhead, St. Cloud, the Twin Cities Metro, especially the West Metro, Minneapolis, and then Rochester and the southeast, and then Mankato and the south central part of the state. So the metro areas, and in Duluth, you can't see it because it's so small, but Duluth also gained population. So again, we have more growth in the urban areas than we do in the rural areas. And a number of these rural areas have a loss of population. So our strategy, well, we have in the League of Voters what we call our People Power Fair Maps campaign. In that campaign, we advocate for, we work toward achieving fair maps, and it's something we work in concert with our partners in the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy and our Maps Minnesota campaign. And our strategy is three-pronged. One is to continue to advocate for legislation to change the redistricting process, to minimize political influence and maximize public engagement and transparency. Secondly, and this is because we're in a map making cycle, and this is different than what really happened 10 years ago, is we want to engage local communities to influence state and local elected representatives to create maps that reflect needs and interests of their communities, getting community input, getting communities to think about what their government should be doing for them. How does it work? What are their policy voices, and are they being heard? And there's a lot of opportunities for input on that, which I'll talk about next week. And then engage legislative legal processes with testimony and alternative maps to influence the final maps. So there's lots of touch points, as I talked about at the beginning on that timeline, with the legislature and with courts, with the redistricting panel, in order to, and with local officials to influence what those maps look like. So some of the options, you can have postcard, letter, email campaigns to elected officials, sponsor redistricting programs. I am more than happy to talk to any group at any time about redistricting and the need for reform of this. Engaging in the legislature and advocating for specific legislation or just general legislative change and progress. I will tell you the Senate has had 2 hearings in their redistricting committee, but they have not had any more. The responsibility in the Senate for the redistricting changes is going to be in the Elections Committee. In the House, the redistricting committee has not yet met. Representative Murphy has told me she intends to have meetings, but I have not heard when they're going to be. And we're working with the both chambers of the legislature on a potential bill that our alliance has worked on. State maps. Let them know what you expect, and you expect them, from a process standpoint to have input, and that defining communities of interest and having those inputs. Work on local maps. There's a lot of touch points you can have on local maps. It's amazing how much money and how many services come from the county level. And actually, it's amazing how few of us, including myself, understand or have understood how much gets done by counties. And then for all of us is developing alternatives map for submissions, and then partnering with local groups, especially those who are census partners, those communities that are underheard, underrepresented in the process of redistricting. Because I know, and I think for a number of us here, we are not going to be disadvantaged by anything that the legislature does. But there are groups that don't have the same voice that we have, don't have the same representation. And it's necessary to make sure that all the community voices are being heard. So with that, I'll open up for questions. I appreciate this opportunity and your time.
Okay, Paul, we've got a number of questions, and I'm going to scroll back to the first one that came from Carl, I believe. Yeah. So Carl asks, won't tentative maps be published before the court's final order?
I don't think so, because that when you say tentative maps, there will likely be maps input to the court from the parties, from the caucuses, potentially from groups like the Our Maps Minnesota campaign. So there will be a number of proposed maps, and so there will be lots of maps drawn. The question is, what are the best maps for the people of Minnesota? And that requires community input to understand how people see their community and what their priorities are. So I think there are and there will be lots of maps drawn. The question is, what is the best maps? And that requires, when I go back to talking about Minnesota, or for any of us who've been in business, you want to get lots of different voices around the table so that you get those inputs, you have the best possible outcome.
Okay. Art asks, would open primaries, oops, I just lost it here. Would open primaries combined with, excuse me, I'm sorry, my screen moved on me. Pardon me. Okay, would open primaries combined with ranked choice voting lessen polarization?
Wow. That's a big question. I can't answer that. I think I've had the benefit of taking a class with Dr. Larry Jacobs at the U this semester. We've talked quite a bit about polarization and the causes and the resolution. Um, yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not able to answer. I wouldn't want to speculate on that. I think the causes, based on what I know, the reasons for polarization are a lot deeper than what ranked choice voting is going to fix.
John asks, isn't there software to help redistricting?
Yes, there's lots of software and there's lots of free software online. There's things our alliance is using a company called Districtor, which is developed by the Tufts University redistricting lab. There's something called there's Dave's redistricting app. There's things you can buy called Maptitude, which we use and the state uses. There's S3. There's a lot of software. Now the question that comes up sometimes is why not let the computer do it? And would that may be what this question is alluding to? And the problem is that there's almost an infinite number of legal maps you could draw. And it's only by talking to people, getting community input, that you can really get the best maps for the people. So you really need to engage and talk to people to get those inputs. Redistricting is part science, part art, and you got to get the art part in from the people, not from a computer.
Okay, Mary asks, and again, pardon me, my screen keeps flying. Does it make a difference that Minnesota has no party designation?
I guess I don't understand what that means.
I'm not sure. Mary, if you want to retype that in at the bottom, we can look at it again. Chris,
well, I guess that means in voting. I mean, I know our registered voters don't identify with a party. And I think if someone were to look at, and when they look at redistricting, a lot of times the parties and others, when you look at competitiveness, for example, if you put that as a criteria, you'll look at what the past election results were. Registrations give you some indication of what may happen, but the reality is you get generally like 30% Republican and 35 or 40% Democrat DFL, then the other 30 to, I mean, that's about 70%, 30, 40% are independent. And those move depending on the election. And we got Republicans moving back and forth. So it could be a metric you use. I'll tell you, Iowa, my recollection is their statutes say you can't look at past election results. So that is a factor that could be used, but most often what you look at is past election results to determine what the likely outcomes are going to be.
Okay. Chris asks, we witnessed a very partisan process to redraw the Wright County district lines after the last census. 4 commissioners got together and redrew the lines, offering 2 or 3 options, all of which managed to get rid of a 5th progressive commissioner. What recourse did we have?
Oh, that's great. Well, a couple of things is there is a path in statute for citizens to challenge the process of redistricting in court. And if the court finds for the challenge of the voters, then the county is required to establish an independent redistricting commission for the county commissioners. That is something I'm talking to one of our leagues about as a contingency. So I think the best thing to do is engage early. I'll talk about this next week about local redistricting strategy, but there's a whole strategy around how to approach this. Provide a spotlight on it, and just listening to the pre-meeting with this group, I think you're a good group to do that. But is to make sure that there's visibility and transparency and attention on what's being done, and make sure that those county commissioners know that you're watching. And then there's a number of things you can do. And then if they still it doesn't result in a process that is representative and transparent, then you potentially can go to court on that. But you use that as your last resort. But understand there is a last resort of going to court.
Okay. Arthur asks, could you define competition?
There's a number of ways of defining competition. Most frequently, I'm trying to think, there's something called, I'm trying to think of the various ways it's defined. And that's one of the difficulties of using competition. You can use efficiency ratio to look at wasted votes. That is one way of looking at it. You can look at partisan lean as another way to look at it. So there's a lot of statistical methods to look at it, but it's basically what's the level of certainty that a district is going to go one party or the other.
Sonia asks if the U.S. Senate passes SR1 for the People Act, does this address redistricting?
It does for federal. Yeah, it addresses it for federal redistricting, for congressional district. It doesn't address legislative because, and I've had some discussions with our attorney, Nick Harper, and about this. Given that it's traditionally been a responsibility of the state, the federal really can only require it for federal redistricting. Now, what happens generally is if the federal government requires something in place for federal elections, states will do it for state elections or state offices also, just from a cost and efficiency standpoint. That is not always true. There are some examples where states have chosen to bifurcate requirements because they want to add additional requirements at the state level. But that's how that works.
Denise asks, where can we find the maps?
You can find them if you look at and I'll send you and the folks a sheet of handy links, but there is, if you look at the Legislative Coordinating Committee GIS page, there's a link there and it'll show you the maps for congressional districts, House and Senate districts. And you can also find county commissioner districts there. And I've found most counties are pretty good at having on their website, and what Wright County is true of this also, pretty good maps in the county website for the county commissioner districts.
Bonnie asks, in general, does redistricting typically keep cities intact as much as possible? I know there have been situations where one city will have 1 or 2 precincts in a different Senate district.
That is generally a criteria that attempted to be maintained. That is in, for example, the court orders typically honoring geopolitical boundaries is a criteria. And I know the legislature generally does that. It is in those criteria in the current Senate bill that just got put in last week. But sometimes, for example, that's really hard in Olmsted County because Rochester's 3/4 of the population of Olmsted County. So it's hard to draw districts where you keep Rochester all in one district. On the other hand, I think that they're going to really push for that because they went along 10 years ago with having the city split. So I know Edina, for example, they've got one little neighborhood in northeast Edina that's in Congressional District 5. And they're wanting to get that moved back into, I'm trying to remember where that's District 2, I think. So yeah, they tried to maintain that, but sometimes it's just very hard to equalize the population. If you think about it, equalizing population is the #1 priority to the courts.
Travis asks, who pays for court?
Usually the people going to court pay.
So if it was Wright County citizens trying to talk to their commissioners?
Yep. And although you might be able to find a nonprofit group that might help you with that, depending on the circumstances. I know that's something, Wright County wasn't subject to the discussion, but I know we've had some discussions in the league state office about if we were to get to that point, because it might be, if there was an opportunity, that might be a good opportunity to make that issue visible, advance the standards, and make a court decision of that. Because there are a lot of those county commissioner redistrictings that really go under the radar by design. They don't want them to be visible.
Okay. There are no other questions in the chat box. There are a couple of websites and things for people to look at. I'm thinking it's probably having to do with maps. I guess, wait, there is one more. Someone's asking, what is the role, pardon me, Denise is asking, what is the role of the county commissioner?
Well, the county commissioners, they are the ones who make policy decisions at the county level, basically where the money's going, what the policies are. And if you think about county budgets and what counties do, they do the roads, they do a lot of infrastructure, they do medical services, they do public safety, they do a lot of garbage, they do, just trying to think of all the things they do, but counties do a lot. After the state budget, the second largest budget in the state is Hennepin County. And people think the cities do a lot, but a lot of things people think cities do actually is county function in Minnesota. So they're the ones who make the decisions about what the priorities are, what the policies are at a county level on those things.
Okay. Paul, we really appreciate your time tonight, and we look forward to next week also. Remember, on the 16th at 7 p.m., Paul will come and again dazzle us with his information, and we'll have a bunch more questions. Paul, is there anything you want to add in wrapping up this evening?
No, I just, Susan, I appreciate you and the rest of Indivisible giving me this opportunity, and look forward to talking in more detail next week.
Okay, well, with that, we'll see you next week, and thank everybody for coming tonight. If you have questions, you can email them to us.
Him next week.
What's it?
Okay. And thank you, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it. See you next week.
Thank you, Susan. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul.